What is worship? A dictionary definition of worship is something along the lines of offering praise and adoration to a deity, although we also sometimes might say like somebody worships somebody else, right? We say that about people. So there's this idea that praise and adoration is offered from one person towards something else. And implied in that, then, is that the energy and the direction of the purpose of worship is for the benefit of the one being worshipped. Now, I'm not sure that definition is adequate because I am guessing probably all of us are in worship today expecting to get something out of it, which means that there's something more happening than just offering praise and adoration. Now, we could also take this question of what is worship and talk about the technicalities, right? Like when we gather in worship, we have confessed, and we've already said some prayers, and we've sung some songs, and there's other things we're going to do that we share in our worship. But I want to offer a different definition today of what happens, or what worship is for us, and then we'll see where that takes us. People are complicated. We are complex. We're saint and sinner simultaneously is one way we say that. Each of us has dreams, right, and longings, some of which we have shared with others, others of which we keep to ourselves. We have joys and celebrations. We also have pains and struggles and fears. And some of those fears, again, we have shared with others, and others of them we won't even say out loud to God. And so each of us is all of that mixed together, right? Hopes and dreams and fears and longings and struggles and pains. And I want to suggest today that worship is what happens when we point all of our complexity toward God with the big G, or if it's not pointed there, right, somewhere. And that when we bring all of our complexity and point it towards God in this thing of praise and adoration and worship we do, that we're doing so, maybe not consciously, but hoping that two things happen. One is that God is going to hold space for us, meaning all of that complexity, right? Space for our dreams, space for our longings, space for our fears and our struggles. And God is going to hold space for us to be just who we are. But two, that God is also going to transform us and change us. Now, we can know that we need change. We can want to change. Do we like to change? No, right? Sometimes we resist the very change that we know is good for us, right? So I'm suggesting that worship is when we point all that we are toward God, hoping that God will hold that and also transform us. Can we say that's a fair definition of worship today? Okay, thank you. Next. If that's worship, we talk sometimes about sacrifices, like the people of Israel had sacrifices they were supposed to make. If that's what worship is, then I would argue that sacrifice is anything we're willing to give up to serve that worship. So today, we have taken time to be in worship. That's something we are giving up to be in this place where we can point all of our complexity toward God. It's also energy that we bring to it. Some of us have terrible singing and speaking mechanics, so just singing is bad for our vocal cords, right? There's a little bit of a sacrifice there. There's financial commitments that we make as being part of a worshiping community. That's sacrifice. So all of those sacrifices we bring serve that worship, worship being pointing our whole complex selves toward God with some kind of praise and adoration. So there's worship, and there's the sacrifice that goes with it. The people of Israel were people, so they were also complicated and complex. They were out in the wilderness, having been led out of slavery. And in the wilderness, sometimes they didn't have enough water, and sometimes they didn't have a sense that they had enough food, and it was completely unpredictable. Slavery was predictable. Unreliable or unpredictable God in the wilderness that you never know what's coming next is a little harder to live with sometimes. And amidst all of that, they have Moses, and they look at Moses and say, this is terrible. Can we go back? Where's the water? Go tell God this. We want that. And Moses is kind of stuck in this middle place of constantly being the voice of God to the people and the voice of the people to God. Well, Moses gets an opportunity to go on a retreat into the mountains. The people have already gotten the commandments. They've had this long-standing, movement through the wilderness. And then Moses gets to go up on the mountain with God for 40 days. Now, I can tell you, because my internship was in the foothills of the Rockies, and we went on retreats to the mountains. It's awesome to get away from the busyness of the day and to sit in the beauty that is the mountains. So Moses is up on the mountain. He does not have to listen to a single complaint. He does not have to settle any cases of disputes between people. He doesn't have to worry about the logistics of the food and the water and the tents and the movement and all of the questions that are coming at him. And I bet he is just loving that space of retreat. And not only is he on a retreat, doesn't have to listen to the traffic and all the rest of it, he also gets to hang out with God. So while all that's going on with Moses, the people of Israel, complicated, complex people, are looking around going, where's God? Here we are out here in the wilderness. We haven't heard anything for a while. Where's Moses? He's the one that always tells us what's going on with God. Is he even coming back? And in that time where they're not hearing from God, which means they pointed all of who they are in their complexity toward God, and they don't feel like they're getting anything back, they say, well, why don't we melt down all our gold, which is a sacrifice, and make a golden calf? So they make their own God. Now, that God is fairly reliably present because they created it, and they can put it wherever they want. They can pray to it. They can celebrate it. Is it going to do anything for them? It's not going to. They might get something out of it because they have created it. But if you have poured all that you are towards something that you created, are you worshiping it, or are you worshiping back to what you want and need, right? Walter Brueggemann would say that the golden calf was a good God because it didn't demand anything of them, right? It's a safe God in that way. So all of that is happening. They have pointed their worship in a different direction, and that's where we pick up the story of Exodus today. And I love this story because basically God is hanging out with Moses, and he says to Moses, hey, your people, the people that you led out of Egypt, are worshiping other God that they created, and they're sacrificing to it. And frankly, I'm a little miffed. Now, God gets angry. I don't think God is just raging angry, feeling offended by it. I think it's more like, as parents, did your kid ever try to stick a screwdriver in an electric socket and you went, did you get mad? Yeah, but it's not, you're concerned, right? God has given them the whole path to life, and they're worshiping other gods, and God's mad. God tells Moses, I'm just going to consume everybody, and that's going to be it. Me and you, we'll start over, and I'll make a great nation out of you, which is the promise that had been for Abraham, but now God's making that promise to Moses. Just like those people of Israel, we're complicated, we're complex. They had a time where they weren't hearing from God, and so they pointed themselves, all of their complexity, toward this golden calf that they made. Have you ever had a time where you've prayed and prayed and prayed and don't feel like you're hearing back from God? Have you ever come to worship and been like, whew, Pastor gets another shot next week? Have you ever been in a worship setting or faith community where you're like, you know what, this music isn't really my thing? And you leave and you think, I didn't really get out of that what I was hoping to get out of it today. We can be in stretches of life where it doesn't feel like we're hearing from God, or that God is present, that we have pointed all of our complexity towards God and done all the sacrificing, and it's coming back empty. Now, one thing we could do is try to make a list of what we then point toward and say, well, maybe we point at this or maybe we point at that. The other thing we could do is just say, where do our sacrifices end up going? Because if we point ourselves and all that we are towards something, and sacrifices are what then we give up in worship, we could just ask, where do we point our sacrifices? How many of you have had a job that demanded and demanded and demanded and demanded your time, your energy, and almost everything you had, and you gave and gave and gave and never got anything back? That's sacrifice, right? It may not be that you're worshiping that thing, but you're sacrificing a lot and pointing yourself in a direction, but it's not holding space for you, and it's not bringing transformation. How many of you have invested resources in something that you thought was a good investment and were told it was, and then had questions about it but kept investing anyway, and then the market fell out and you just went, oh, that wasn't holding space for you. That wasn't bringing transformation. How many of us have poured ourselves into a relationship? And it could be any kind of relationship, friendship, right? Marriage, whatever, where we have given and given and given while the other took and took and took. Did they hold space? Transformation? And sometimes that's ourselves, right? Like we can point back in on ourselves and think, you know what? I can hold space for me and I can bring transformation if I just sacrifice enough and get it all done. So just like those people of Israel, we can sense that God is absent or feels absent. We don't get the word from the Lord we want. And whether we do it consciously or not, we can take all that we are and instead of pointing it towards God, point it someplace else. Now Moses is hanging out with God on the mountain still. And Moses has a response. God says, the people that are yours, that you led out of Egypt, have worshipped wrong and sacrificed wrong, and I'm going to just consume the whole thing. Had God said that to Moses on day one of the retreat, when Moses was tired and had just said all the fresh complaints, I think he might have just said, that sounds great. But he's been on the retreat. Like he's been away. He's had some time to reflect. And so Moses says back to God, these are your people that you led out of Egypt. Not, right? Because that's what God said to Moses. Moses says, no. These are your people. And you led them out of Egypt. And by the way, God, you already made a promise. You're promising to make a new nation out of me. You made that promise already to Abraham and to Isaac and to Israel. So why don't you just go ahead and keep that promise? Because if you don't, the people of Egypt are going to say, hold on, then. That wasn't really a God of steadfast love and mercy and compassion. That wasn't the God that they said it was. This turns out to be a different God. And God changes God's mind. God changes. We talk about God as all-powerful and all-knowing and sort of unchangeable, but in this story, God changes. It's the same thing that happens after the flood. God changes God's mind. Can the golden calf change its mind? No, because the golden calf doesn't do anything, right? The golden calf is predictable. God is kind of unpredictable, but unpredictable in a way that takes the people toward life. So Moses pushes back on God and says, why don't you go ahead and keep that promise? And God says, okay. So as we come to worship today, and we may find ourselves feeling like sometimes we don't hear from God, maybe we're not getting everything out of worship that we hoped. At the beginning of the week, this week, I would have told you that worship is not something we consume and that we're not supposed to get anything out of it, right? That we direct our worship toward God, and that's it. And if we get something out of it, that's sort of a nice thing that happens. But what Moses says to God is, hey, this is a relationship. Yes, we worship you, because that's part of the covenant. But you also made promises in that covenant. This is a back and forth. So it turns out we actually are supposed to get something out of worship because our God is not an inanimate object, but an unpredictable God that moves and promises and brings life and change and transformation. God does hold that space for us and does bring that transformation. It just doesn't always look the way we think it's going to look or happen when we think it's going to happen. And so as we gather in this space, we do gather and we do get things out of worship. And we do journey through this together. Now, to this point, I've been comparing us to the people of Israel. who point themselves in the wrong direction sometimes and make sacrifices that aren't maybe the right ones. But I want to take a minute and visit with Moses a little bit, because Moses stands there and argues with God. Is that part of your prayer life? It might be. I think part of what this text invites us to do is argue with God. And a particular argument with God. To stand up and say, God, you promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that you were going to make a great nation, and you had those promises. And you promised that Jesus, who died on the cross, was going to take us to new life. And sometimes, God, I'm not seeing that. So why don't you keep your promise and make it evident and show up and help us see that? Does that mean we're going to see it right away? No. But that's basically what Moses does, and I think that's a fair prayer for us to say, not just for ourselves, but for the sake of the world. To add to our prayer, hey, God, you promised. You promised new life. We're expecting new life. We don't always see new life. You promised to hold space for us and to transform us, so how about you make that good and obvious so that we can see that it is happening? We're complicated and complex. We're still going to point in other directions, right? We're still going to make sacrifices that don't go towards that worship of God. But then we're going to continue to gather around this table where God has poured out God's self into wine and into bread, so that regardless of where we are pointing, God is always pointing toward us and giving everything for us so that we might have life. If we argue with God a little bit, we're just joining Moses in longing and dreaming and hoping for the promise that already is, so that we can see it and know it and share it and live in it, not just for what we get out of it, but for the sake of the world around us. Amen.